You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
So hello and welcome to I Thought You'd Like to Know. I am Mary Kloska and I am your host today, and I am so happy to be with David Clayton, who is very multifaceted in his gifts. He is a professor at the Pontifex University, and he is a iconographer, and he is an author. And I am very interested to get to know him better along with you, our listeners. So welcome, David.
Pleasure to be here, man. Thank you.
It's wonderful to meet you. There's so many different things that I could ask you about at the very beginning, but would you like to just kind of give a little bit of background as to who you are to our audience?
Yes. So I grew up in England. You can probably hear from the accent. A Catholic convert. I converted in my early 30s. I'm now 58. And very quickly started to pursue art and painting. Really, the desire to do this was part of the process of change in my life that also involved my conversion. The two are very much connected, and it's something that I think we'll explore a little later in this conversation. So I started to paint, or try to learn to paint, and in the process develop ideas about how you could teach painting, because I just couldn't find anywhere to train.
Right.
And eventually I, something like 12 years ago, after really teaching myself and developing ideas about how you could teach painting, I came to the United States and had a position as artist in residence at a Catholic liberal arts college in New Hampshire called Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. And then that's when I started to blog and write. I'd never really written very much before then. And so the books that I've written have come out of just having ideas and putting them on a computer screen, putting them together, really. And then I think 5 years ago in October, I started work with Pontifex University, which is a startup. It's a new university. At that point, they had no programs, and the inaugural program, which they asked me to create as the new provost of the university's academic dean, was a Master of Sacred Arts program. So that was launched a year later, and now we have also a theology doctorate program and an MA in the theology of the body and the new evangelization, which we offer in conjunction with Christopher West and the Theology of the Body Institute.
Oh, wow. That is incredible. I will tell you, when I read about the university, it made me want to go back to school. I thought, I want to study that, and I want to study that. It's a phenomenal approach to education through beauty, primarily. It's what you want to explain?
Yes.
The program that you developed?
Yes. So the Master of Sacred Arts actually came out of this book. I'm just going to hold it up. I'm not going to do a screen share, but I'll just
absolutely.
So this was published just about 6 years ago, something like that, 6 or 7 years ago. And it was an encapsulation of my discoveries on how artists were taught traditionally in the Catholic world. And I started to do research on this because I wanted to found an art school, and then the idea initially was then I would enlist as its first student and actually get a training. And then in time I realized that I was probably going to have to be the teacher, because it was difficult to find people who had the skills or had the combinations of skills that were necessary. So I put these ideas on art education into this book called The Way of Beauty, Liturgy, Education and Inspiration for Family, School and College. And it's outlined not just the technical side of it. In the end, that became a minor part of it. There is a need for technical skill as an artist, but it was also about the cultural formation, how you can form somebody to be open to inspiration, for example. Right. Is that possible? How you teach people to conform to a traditional style, so that it doesn't just become individual expression, for example. And how you engender creativity within these traditions, so that for all that there were certain methods and prescriptions for what was required for art in the church, the variety and the diversity of what is in the church's tradition of art is immense. Right. And so it occurred to me that if I'd really had captured the secret, shall we say, of art education, if I'm right, then this is something that all people would like, not just artists. Right. Who doesn't want to be creative and open to inspiration in their lives? Right. And who doesn't want to do whatever they do beautifully? Exactly. The sort of things that might seem mundane to others, but you're called to. And an accountant is a boring profession to some. Right. Those who are called to be accountants, they just think it's wonderful. And they would see it as something in which they express themselves creatively in conformity to higher ideals, even something like that. And so I then wanted to place this method in the context of a general Catholic education. And so I started to do a lot of research on what a Catholic education is. Right. And I realized that actually what I was describing, aside from the artistic technique, which was just special to the vocation of a visual artist, everything else was the basis of a general Catholic education. And I felt that it was lacking certainly in most places that called themselves Catholic, and that there were certain elements I felt that all Catholic colleges, and I mean even those that were trying to be true to the magisterium, shall we say, would benefit from. And so I wrote this book, and it was after that was published that Pontifex approached me and said, we would like you to create this inaugural program because we want the ethos, if you like, of education that's in this book to be the basis of what we do. And so the Master of Sacred Arts became the first program we offered. It really set out, it was a statement that set out our mission as a university, as well as being something that is of great interest. We have many students signing up for it, but it gives people something they can understand, shall we say, even if they're doing the theology doctorate program, they can understand what marks us out as different from other universities as a result of this. It also is a good talking point. There's a need for beauty and a transformation of the culture. I think many people feel that. And so it creates an interest in a way that if we'd started with just a theology program, it's very difficult to describe what distinguishes that from others. Right. Whereas the Master of Sacred Arts, it's unique. It's a unique program, and it again attracts attention to us, so that we've got a story to tell.
One of the classes I saw that you offer had to do with the beauty of numbers or something like that. Yes. And I said to my dad, who's an accountant, last night, I want to study the beauty of numbers. And he said, oh, Mary, I'm an accountant. Numbers aren't beautiful. He carves. He has some artistic, side to him. But that was fascinating because I've never thought of that. Do you want to talk a little bit just about
that? Yes. So It's interesting you call it the beauty of numbers. I called it the mathematics of beauty. The other way
maybe
around.
that is it.
But the point is that the ancients thought that mathematics as a field in itself had a symmetry, just in the very nature of number, if you like. There was a beauty to it, the interrelationships between numbers. So I do talk about the beauty of number as well as the numbers of beauty, if you like.
The numbers of beauty.
So that came out. But if I were to describe what characterizes this so that people can understand it just through one aspect of it, if you look at old buildings, I mean, typically you go to, especially European cities, but it's true in American cities, particularly those in the East, anything that has buildings that were built before the Second World War, pretty much. On the whole, it's those older buildings that people find attractive and beautiful.
Right.
And it's not an accident. It's not just that the modern ones are made out of concrete and glass or something like that. It's actually part of the very design, the proportions of the buildings themselves, the way the windows in a building relate to each other. Not all the windows are the same size in old buildings. They tend to get smaller as you go higher, and that's deliberate. And the rate at which they reduce corresponds to certain mathematical ideals that are derived from the observation of things and analysis of things that people find beautiful, such as music, so musical harmony. You can abstract numbers from those. And then the assumption would be that if you build those numerical relationships into buildings as well, or even into the proportions of art. So you can relate. So if anyone's looking at these screens, there's a ratio between the size of the tile that I'm in and the top of it. The top is longer than the side as I'm looking at it now. Now, in the ancient world, they say, well, that has to be the ratio, say, 3 to 4, because we want this to be beautiful. The test, I would say, of whether that theory is correct is whether or not people subsequently find the buildings beautiful when they're made. And I would say that on the whole they do, because if you go to Florence in Italy, millions of people, or Oxford, which I think is as beautiful a city as an Englishman, the buildings that the tourists go and see and choose to look at are the buildings that are created in these traditional proportions, whereas they're not flocking to the buildings on the outskirts of the city that are modern and new on the whole. And so the basis of the mathematics of beauty comes from an analysis of natural beauty on the whole, either through music or proportions that you see in nature, and then transposing those relationships into the construction of buildings. But then you can embed those numerical relationships into all sorts of things. You can have sort of plot structures in stories, for example. Certain proportions, you get a turn in the plot. And even within the Bible, for example, you see numerical relationships within the way that it's set out that again correspond to these ideas of number. And so as an artist, what you have to do is be aware of these, but then also understand how to use them appropriately to what it is you're trying to create. It's a bit like being a composer in music. It doesn't matter how well you understand the rules of harmony and melody and composition. It still doesn't. You still have to know how to use them well, and that comes from inspiration and innate sense of what makes a good melody. You have to stand back and look at your work and make a judgment on it, just as an individual. And that's true in art and architecture as well. but there are some mathematical guidelines for artistic composition, just as there are in musical composition.
Right. Oh, it's incredible to think about that. That's really incredible. Do you see? So you started out as an artist, right? And then wanting to learn, and then you went and you wrote the book, and then you ended up in the teaching part. When you think about yourself, do you think about yourself primarily as an artist, or more of a writer, or more of a teacher at this point? Do you feel like you're still?
Yeah, that's interesting. I began wanting to paint, wanting to be an artist. And as I say, then because I couldn't get the training, doing some research into the methodologies. And so I would say that primarily, if I've got anything to offer, it is these ideas about transforming the culture and transforming the art that I developed as a result of trying to paint. And as a result of that, I've never pursued painting as my primary career. I've always just done it. And I've got, I decided that some way down the line that transmitting these ideas was probably the thing that was more important. And so as a writer, I don't think of myself as a good writer at all. I find it a battle. And I get people who read my blog saying, "Oh, we love your ideas, but couldn't you get an editor?" You know,
They say that to you? That's awful.
Oh yeah, they do. You know, look at all these typos. I say, I know, and I do my best, but I can't. So I'm not primarily a writer. I think I'm good enough to transmit the ideas, but I wish I was better. And the same with teaching. I think I can communicate the ideas. But the main reason,
you're more the philosopher behind all of this.
Yes. If I do it successfully, it's because the ideas are good, and I'm just adequately articulating them, is what I would say.
Wow. Do you still paint today? I mean, did you kind of put that aside, or?
It's funny. I haven't for a while because I've been. It's quite a lot of work to be involved in starting a university. It's not just me, but
I understand. I can imagine.
So, but I was beginning to think I might just be at the point where I can put some time aside to start doing it again. I always have this hope that at some point I'll retire and then I can just devote myself to painting. And it hasn't happened yet.
You do enjoy it.
Oh, I enjoy it, and I never feel that I can abandon it for too long. But I've never fully devoted myself to it. Even when I was artist in residence at Thomas More College, and so with that position, I filled the chapel with art systematically at the college, which is still there.
Do you have something that you prefer to paint that really sets your heart on fire? I've trained as an iconographer. I also trained as a portrait painter. And the reason that I did those two extremes, one highly naturalistic, the other very stylized, was I was actually aiming for what I perceived to be somewhere between the two, which is the Gothic style. And I feel that with all my sort of theories and ideas about how you develop style, I'm ready to develop this sort of 21st century Gothic style, which I've characterized. It's begun to be part of me anyway, I would say naturally, but I've characterized it as the school of St. Albans, just because it seems to capture the imagination when I call it that. But St. Albans is this city with a large cathedral in southern England, which had a flowering of art in the sort of 13th century and the 14th century. So you can go to St. Albans Cathedral and there are these wall paintings, but also what we have mostly are these beautiful Gothic illuminations, and particularly one artist called Matthew Paris. Now, they had a style which I think connects with people today. So it was largely description of form by line, and Matthew Paris
if people can look him up on Google Pictures, he had a sort of animator's flourish. He could have been a Walt Disney animator.
Oh, okay.
With smooth flow of line, and the way that he imbued character, soul, effectively, into his figures, resonates, I think, with people today. So very strong description of form with line, and then loose washes of color, very often leaving the manuscript or the paper or the vellum, whatever he's painting on, showing through. So he didn't cover everything with paint.
Oh, okay.
And so now it's difficult not to paint everything. It sounds, you think it'd be more easier, just more difficult to cover everything with paint. It isn't. Knowing when not to do it is actually a great skill. So if I was just thinking, actually just today, I was thinking about what I would do, if I put this time aside, what I would plan to do. And it is really developing a style that's something like that, but in accordance with my own theories, I'm going to be true to what I tell everybody. It has to connect with people today as well. So I want to participate in a tradition, but I want it to have an appeal to ordinary people. So it needs to be mobile, but at the same time accessible. So stuff that is so highbrow that only elites can appreciate it is really no good. Or so lowbrow, shall we say, that it has a sort of mass appeal, but only to the lowest common denominator in us. That's not good either. We need something that is simultaneously high art and popular art. And that's what Christian art always was. It was noble and accessible. High in its ideals, but broad in its accessibility. And that's what we have to do today.
Now, when I looked at the website of your art, you had painted all of those pictures on that site that I was shown?
Yes.
Like that Jesus? Was that Jesus yours? It wasn't one of the icons. Okay, that is incredible, I have to tell you, because I did missionary work overseas. And there were several people in Poland I met, and we were talking about how they were searching for their Jesus. You know how, like, there's so many different depictions of the crucifixion. What Jesus on the cross appealed to them? And I remember how excited one day when a few separately came to me with that image and said, Mary, I found my Jesus. This is the one that out of all the images I've seen has grabbed my heart the most. So when I opened that site, I thought, oh, wow, he did that one? Because, I originally encountered it in Poland.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's two there. One of them is in this Gothic style, rather like a Cimabue, which would be Italian from, I'm going to say, the 13th century, something like that. I probably got the dates wrong, but around then.
And that's the one with the black background?
Yes, okay. So
that's the one that I think.
Yeah, okay. And so I deliberately did it in that style, but I changed things, I felt subtly, so that it would appeal to the modern eye. So it's in a Gothic style, but we're used to natural representation as well. And so I just naturalized the features in the face, for example, so that we could, so that the modern person could relate to them. But I hope that this was my intention, without departing from the Gothic stylization. So what I wanted to do was, I didn't want to make it seem so natural that it didn't also, that you eliminated, shall we say, that otherworldly quality.
Right,
so that
like the divine.
So the importance of that you have a sort of partial abstraction or stylization, in other words, a departure from strict natural appearances, is that it always speaks in some way of another world, and so it takes us towards itself and then beyond to a different place. And if you do that well, and these traditions of the Gothic and the iconographic have been developed in order to draw us in and then evoke the heavenly dimension, so the other world in which they suggest, if they're successful, and I think they are, is heaven.
Right.
It is possible to do it badly, and Adobe Photoshop is, people change appearances all the time, but you can do it with bad motives. So a lot of advertising hoardings, that there's lots of airbrushing, as they call it.
Right.
It is done to evoke a disordered, erotic response in order to sell goods, for example. And so you can draw out certain truths in a way that distorts, and then therefore is to the detriment of the whole, or highlights things beautifully to draw out what is good in the person. And that's the skill of the artist, I would say. Wow,
it's incredible. Now, I see a banjo in your background. Is that a banjo? Do you play music?
Yes.
Is that part of your artistic?
Well, I'm not asked to perform. 30 years ago, I actually did a master's degree in engineering at Michigan Tech, which is...
Oh, did you?
Way
My
up
neck of the woods.
Okay, way up in northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula. It's not... And while I was there, I fell in with a crowd of people who played this Appalachian-style folk music. Fiddles and banjos and this sort of thing.
Wow, that's
and
super.
So they taught me to play a few tunes, and I've always maintained it, but I'm not... I play about half a dozen tunes quite well, but actually one of the things that I always enjoyed doing it, when I converted, I was encouraged by this guy who was he was my Catholic sponsor. He was an influential man in my faith. He was a Catholic who had really mentored me into becoming a Catholic. I'd started off as an atheist, and he encouraged me to believe that that everybody has a vocation, has a calling, and for the most part, it's what we love to do, because then we're most fulfilled. And I was actually choosing between art and banjo playing, would you believe it?
Really?
Yeah. And because I'd gone to these bluegrass festivals in the US, I just thought, what a great life. You're just on these sort of sultry hot summer evenings.
Saunter through life.
Sort of playing in front of these crowds. But in the end, I decided not to pursue it, mainly because what a musician does most of the time is practice. It's not perform. So you have to love practicing. And I didn't realize I don't really. I like, once I know something, I like playing that. I don't like learning stuff. Whereas with art, I actually enjoyed the process of painting. And so I think that's probably more what I should aim for. And so
do you think Pontifex University would have a music? Would that something that would play into that? I mean, your concept of beauty, there's an art in that too, and it kind of ties in with theology, and it ties in with your philosophy of art and beauty and numbers. And could you see it? Could you see it expanding?
Yeah. So we have different concentrations. So. My hope is that ultimately this will inspire people in any creative discipline. But it is the creation process really would come after the Master of Sacred Art. So there's a little bit of a studio element, but for the most part, it is studying, and the goal is a formation, which then you can bring to whatever sort of creative pursuit you choose. So it could be music or architecture, but we have a partnership with St. Joseph's Seminary in New York, they're in Yonkers, I think, who have sacred music classes there. And so as part of the electives, rather than doing the studio art classes, which is a small part of the Master of Sacred Arts, they can do classes in Gregorian chant and music.
No bluegrass, right?
No bluegrass. But I'm not, I think the ethos, I would say, of this, while the premise, if you like, of culture is that we have is that the wellspring of culture, in other words, the source of Catholic culture is the liturgy, is our worship. It begins there. So there are outside influences, but there's an inside influence which is most important, and that is God himself, if you like, as we encounter him in the liturgy. So it's beyond this world first and foremost. Now, informing that, you can have external cultural influences, but the main dynamic is one of a well coming out and then up and out into the world, if you like. And so through that, you have you can influence the external culture. So as you go out into the world, you then are you can create things beautifully as formed by this encounter with God. And you can then, all aspects of popular culture can be influenced by this in a way that is proper to what they are. So there's nothing wrong with bluegrass or playing the banjo or having popular music or even dancing in discos. Any of that sort of stuff can be all good, clean fun. And you wouldn't want Gregorian chant for those things at all. I mean, there's a place for everything. I wouldn't want banjo music in churches either, I hasten to add. But what should be the primary influence on all of these external aspects of the culture should be the sacred, even if it's just an assumed, an assumption of what is true and beautiful that is brought into it. It doesn't. If it's explicit, then it tends to be rather sort of poor, obvious Christian culture. What you want is a culture that's built upon an assumption of the precepts of the faith and the precepts of beauty that then speaks to people today. And so my hope is that through this formation, which is certainly focused on the core, on the heart of it, which is the liturgical forms, people will be able to go out and engage people in other aspects of the culture in a way that is informed by this this Christianity. And always historically, of course, now cultural appropriation is a sort of dirty phrase. You can't do it, but that's what Christianity has always done. I say it's a good thing. They've always engaged other cultures, harnessed what is good, added what is Christian to it, and so you end up with an expression of Christian culture that is particular to a time and a place, and speak to the people of the world. And so I am in favor of cultural appropriation, and that is Christianity elevates every culture that it comes into contact with, I would say.
Do you feel like that is what happened with you? Now, you mentioned that you were an atheist and you went through conversion. Does this kind of come out of your experience? Like, did you have contact with Christianity that kind of rubbed off on you? Tell me a little about your story more personally.
So I had contact with Christians, and so when I read about the methods of the new evangelization, for example, where it was mostly how people were, and I don't know that they were trying to evangelize. They were just people that I came across who were Christian and over the years impressed me. But particularly this guy, David, that I mentioned, and I actually write about in another book, actually. I talk about his method of evangelization in a book called The Vision for You. But certainly I was interested in art, and I was interested in traditional, beautiful art as I saw it. And then eventually what sort of connected everything with the Catholic faith was wandering into a church called the Brompton Oratory. I've told this story many times to those who've heard me speak.
Not to me.
All right. But it's a church in London that has a beautiful, beautiful liturgy, a choir that sings Palestrina, and everything was just working in harmony. And I'd never seen this before. And that gave me the sense that that Christianity is the source of its own culture, and it's timeless and placeless. And that is then informing all other things. Because I remember I walked into this church, and it was Renaissance polyphony, it was Victorian neo-Baroque art. The Mass, it was a Novus Ordo Mass, but it was actually in Latin and Ad Orientem. So I couldn't understand what was going on. But what was interesting was I was so unfamiliar with it that I really could. I remember thinking, where does this come from? I actually thought Middle Eastern. I mean, it's amazing now that people castigate it as Western European. That isn't how it struck me. I was a secular Westerner going into this thing who'd had no contact with this before. And I was listening to Gregorian chant as well. And the overall impact, I recognized polyphony as a genre a little bit, and I knew that came from Renaissance Italy just about, barely. But if you ask me about the event itself, what I was participating in, seeing, I remember thinking, is this Middle Eastern? It doesn't seem of the West, it doesn't seem now. It's a different place and a different time.
Wow.
And
that's beautiful that the liturgy would bring you to that, because, that's the essence of who Jesus was humanly, Yes. He didn't come as a Frenchman.
No.
And so there's something very authentic in that.
Yes. And when people talk about Christian culture being Western imperialism or something like that, I said, this is absurd. It isn't Western European. It's Middle Eastern. If there is an imperialism, it's Middle Eastern imperialism of Western Europe. And anyway, it's not imperialistic if people are choosing to and attracted to it. If it's a free choice to adopt it, it's an offering of something that is good and beautiful. And if people choose to have it, in fact, it doesn't matter where it comes from, how you choose to define it. If it's good and beautiful and true, and people want it, then it's the right thing to give it to people. But it actually doesn't originate in Western Europe. This is just a nonsense.
That's so interesting.
And the forms that are built into it, the mathematics of it, the artistic forms are from the Eastern Mediterranean. They're not European at all. And they were established, and the basic structures of them were established before Western Europe even became recognized as something as Western Europe. It was a kind of backwater when all this was done.
Wow, that is just incredible. Do you think that beauty in itself, then, like I look at your example, just the beauty of what you saw can elevate a soul to know God? Do you think beauty has that in itself? I think God created all beauty, so it's a reflection of God somehow, but just kind of talk about that a little bit, coming from an atheist background then to what you are now.
I would say that it's probably rare for someone. I have heard people say that the beauty of a piece of music made them believe in God. I would say that's rare. I doubt that it happens very often. I think what it does do is open up our hearts to the source of all beauty, who is God. So if I see a beautiful sunset, there is this certain sense of awe and wonder, and I want to drink it in. But at the same time, it is unsatisfactory. We want more. We desire more than it can give us. It's a bit like savoring the smell of a cooking meal, but never actually getting to eat the meal. That's what the beauty of the world is like, I think.
Right.
And so it creates, it draws us in, and it creates a sort of certain satisfaction, but at the same time, it gives us a sense that there's something more. Now, that does mean some people can just stop there. They don't necessarily go on and for what further, for what is the source of that. For others, it will begin a search, and that's what it did with me. I started to wonder where this had come from. I wanted it more intensely. I wanted it more fully. And eventually I realized it was God that I was seeking. So I needed those examples of people. That is the point at which you can start to tell people the good news, if you see what I mean.
Okay.
And fortunately for me, there were people telling me. So,
right. Did you switch over? Is that at the point that you switched over to doing Christian art, with the icons and all of that? Did you continue to do that, like something kind of secular too, or did it kind of draw you more to focus on that?
Well, it's very difficult to be. If you want to learn to do something, it's better to focus on one thing and not get carried away. So that's why I've never been fully an artist, a writer, or a teacher.
Okay.
Anyway, putting that aside, I've always felt that I'd like to develop landscapes, and I've always done other things on the side. I did study portrait painting and felt that I didn't want to do that particularly. It was great to learn the skills so that you could actually do a painting that looked a bit like somebody.
Right.
But it doesn't. No, in fact, I think it's a useful thing to maintain, even if your primary focus is sacred art, to maintain something that is sacred or profane, in other words, outside the temple, in order to get a sense of that connection that it's what is in the temple has to speak in some way to what is outside.
Incarnate it, right.
Yeah, and vice versa. So if you do landscape, it needs to be informed in some way by what people are going to see visually when they go into the church. And so I think having both there will enable one to help the other, although in practice, people are probably going to focus predominantly on one. And so for the most part, I've focused on the sacred art.
Right. No, it's really beautiful. I have a kind of a different take, kind of a question. You said that book, then you mentioned the family, that it has to do with beauty in the family too, correct?
Yes.
Can you talk about the family, your vision? So I see how you're using it at a university level, but how do you think beauty would affect the family? And what kind of tools do you think you have there that could help? The family is such, an important cell of all of culture, and it's being so attacked. I think that if we can elevate, the beauty.
The family, or I'm always conscious that there are a lot of single people, and so it always seems with these things, all we ever do is address families. That's very good because it's, like you say, it's so important. But what's the role then? It's the household or the community of which you're part, whatever you could think of as your primary sort of relational cell. I use that horrible phrase, but you see what I mean? People who share a house, for example, you can do this too, even if it isn't your family. But what I would say is that you can pray together, and then in terms of the culture, and another book that I co-wrote is called The Little Oratory, A Beginner's Guide to Praying in the Home.
Oh, wow.
Which is directed directly towards that question. And it's encouraging families to pray together and communities, groups of people to pray together, especially focused on the Liturgy of the Hours, but engaging with visual imagery as you do it. So also, if you want to be an artist, I'd encourage you to do it in sacred art, because if you want to produce art that nourishes people's prayer,
Right.
your chances of being able to do that are going to be much, much higher, I would say, if you habitually paint with visual art yourself and you pray well.
Right.
Then what will happen is that you will instinctively paint art that nourishes your own prayer, and if you're praying well and you're a good artist, then the art you produce will be sacred and beautiful. But that habit of praying with an icon corner, with an image corner, I see you have one behind you.
Yes, I have lots of icons.
Yeah, but we tend to, in the Roman Church particularly, it's not so much in the Eastern or Byzantine churches, but we tend to, prayer is something where you clasp your hands and close your eyes.
Right.
Whereas in the Eastern Church, it's something where you're much more open-faced, if you like, and you're looking at something. And I was struck by this when I was with an Orthodox family, when I was studying iconography, and they did grace before meals. And actually, they just sang the Our Father together. But what they did is they all just turned and looked at the icon of Christ and addressed God through the image of Christ. And I think that is the habit we should get into. What I would say also is that we should be doing that in the churches. So at the moment, this is a general sort of characterization, so I'm not saying it's true everywhere, but even if we have beautiful art in churches, there's a general improvement, I would say, at the moment, after the disasters of, I don't know, the last 60, 70 years, where horrible, ugly art is produced. It will only be a beautiful backdrop to the process of worshipping God if we don't engage with the art. And I was struck by this again in Byzantine liturgies, where every time the Mother of God or Our Lady is mentioned, the priest comes out, incenses the icon, everybody turns to the image and sings the prayer. And so they're not nose buried in books, they're not eyes closed, they're very much and engaging with the art that is in the church. It's an aid to their worship and their prayer. And that, I think, is a habit that we need to develop. So just for myself, whenever I'm in the Mass and we do the Our Father, Christ said, those who've seen me have seen the Father. And St. Paul says, he is the image of the invisible God. Therefore, when you say Our Father, turn and look at a statue or an image of Christ as you do it, and try and develop that habit. That way we will make the connection between the spiritual and the material. And so if we want to contribute to the culture in any way, not just in art or music, we will have a natural sense of how to manifest the good and the beautiful and the true in what we happen to do in the culture.
Right. I was going to say, when I'm in a church that's very beautiful, and I mean, many modern day churches don't do this, but you go into a basilica or a cathedral that's, very beautiful, and you've got the sacred images everywhere, it draws you into that visual prayer. So like, I think of like at Notre Dame here in South Bend, when I go into the basilica and I pray, at the Our Father, my eyes are drawn up, and then you see all the saints and you see the image of the Father, and it's something that draws you into that. And when people are creating churches, I think that if they have that in mind, I mean, the way that you can affect the prayer going on there is incredible, because and when they have stars, on the sky or something that like draws you into heaven that way, know?
It certainly does that, and then the next. So it works both ways, as you say. The art can draw us into engagement with it, and a lot of the visual devices that are used in iconography and Gothic art, and Baroque art, actually, traditional Christian sacred art, it's designed to do that. There are visual devices which are created to engage you, but at the same time, it has to be done so it's not a distraction, so it's done in harmony with the worship. And that is the difficulty. So, sometimes it's something that the lay people can just choose to do in the way that I described earlier. But also it's something that the priest can think about. There are certain freedoms that are allowed to the priest in the celebration of the Mass that might allow him to turn and face things, to incense things, or for servers to do that.
Well, think about when he raises his eyes to heaven. There are times where he is supposed to look up to heaven. Basically, he's being a living icon.
Yeah.
Because, he'll say, Jesus raised his eyes to heaven, and then he raises his eyes, and then we are drawn up into that prayer with him. So it's almost like being a living icon of that moment.
Yes, that's certainly true. Again, I hesitate to overemphasize this because you don't want it to become a distraction. Exactly. It has to be in harmony with what it is. The thing that occurred to me is that perhaps the processions of the gifts and then also the entrance and the recession are places at which effectively there is some freedom to stop and engage with images or icons or something without it distracting that could enhance, for example. So there are soft spots that could be in which this could be done appropriately. I think I'm not an expert. I don't want to lecture priests on how they do it. That's their department. But that's the other reason why I encourage lay people to do the Liturgy of the Hours, because that's our department. We can pray the Liturgy of the Hours, and it's authentically liturgical. We're exercising our priestly role as lay people. And so when we do that in the domestic church, it's an authentic part of the church. It's praying the Psalms.
So say that there's somebody who watched this today and they're really interested in all of your philosophy. What is your advice to them? Buy a book, call the university.
Well, all of the above, yes. So my blog, which is also a sort of magazine for the university, is thewayofbeauty.org. And through that, just contact me if you've got any doubts or questions. I like getting emails from people. I always do my best to answer them quickly. I enjoy talking to people who are interested in this sort of thing. Pontifex University is www.pontifex.university. So it's not .org, it's .university. But the easiest thing is to remember thewayofbeauty.org, and from there you can see all of these things. You can see the books that I've written on the books page, even the chant I've written for the Psalms in English, on Psalm Tones page. There's a podcast, there's blog posts, and my paintings. The one thing that is neglected actually is that I'm not very good at promoting the painting. I tend to be focused on other things, so that page isn't as up to date as it could be. But nevertheless, you can get a feel for what I do. So that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to add here? We're kind of getting towards the end. I didn't even look at the questions I had for you. You're so interesting.
Well, thank you, Mary. You make it. You're a good
Very
interviewer.
interesting.
So all I would say is that I just want to emphasize and it is one of the books that I've written, but it's called The Vision for You. And so, again, you can see it on Amazon or my books page. But every single one of us has a personal calling. And So it is to be with God in heaven. It is to be a Christian. But in contributing to those ultimate ends, we have a life here in the world in which we're called to lead a happy and fulfilling and joyous life. Mm-hmm. And so many of you listening are really being called, I think, to contribute to the culture in your own unique way. And so I would, whether it's by reading this book, which has it encapsulates the ways that I was shown to try and develop this, look for those things that, as a Christian, give you joy, and then start to build on those in your life. Don't burn your bridges. You've got to put food on the table. You've got to maintain responsibilities. But if you're doing that, at least in part, I believe the path will open up in front of you. And I just finished with one story, actually, that I went to see a priest in Florence who was an American who had joined the Italian church because he'd been a Yale art professor, Father Timothy Vernon, and it was quite difficult to get access to. Everyone wanted to talk to him because they thought he could commission art, and he was on the staff at the Duomo. He was as I say, he'd been a Yale art history professor who had then become a priest. Anyway, eventually I managed to meet him, and he very kindly saw me, and I asked him about my ideas for art schools and transforming the culture. And he listened to me, and at the end, he had one or two questions, and then he said, and the way you describe it, I don't know what he'd seen in what I'd said or what it was particularly. He said, I really want to recommend that you follow this. I think this is your vocation. So I thought, fantastic, he's going to open doors for me. And he said, but I'm not going to help you, he said, because this is what I do, but you don't need me to help you. God will show you the way if you follow this. But then he said something that was very interesting. He said, I can't even guarantee that you'll be successful if you follow this. But what I will say is that if it is your calling, you will be happy and you will be fulfilled. And even more importantly, whether you're aware of it or not, you will be drawing people into the faith, because that is our vocation in this life.
Wow, that's incredible. That's really incredible.
So I was partly disappointed. A bit.
Yes, but it's true. But it is true. And,
yes, it is true.
Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, right? Yes. And so only when we're doing that which we're created to do will we have that fulfillment or that peace or that joy.
Yeah.
So incredible. Well, this has been a very fast hour.
Same for me. Thank you.
There's a lot for me to think about, too. Well, I appreciate you being here with me tonight. And I hope that our listeners take this opportunity to look up and follow your blog and get your book. Is it available on Amazon or through your blog?
So you can go to the books page on my blog, but they're all on Amazon as well.
Okay.
So if you Google the title and my name.
Right. Just David Clayton and it'll kind of come up.
I don't know about that, but I'm not at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, but
That's the way God works, you know that? He always starts with the little guys, and that's who he uses to transform the world. Look at Our Lady today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So wonderful. Well, God bless you. This has been such a blessing, and we're thankful for all of you who joined us today, and we hope that you reach out and contact David with any further questions. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you. God bless you, David.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.